Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome, Andrea. Nice to see
Hi, good
you.
to see you.
Welcome to our final episode of this season
Yeah.
of Lights, talking to kids about human trafficking. My name is Liz Radzicki. I'm an education specialist at Participate.
And I'm Andrea Powell, and I am the Director of Survivor and Youth Engagement at Unitas. And at Unitas, we work to keep kids safe from all forms of human trafficking. We have a prevention education curriculum for schools and community groups, as well as providing multidisciplinary online content for parents, youth, caretakers, and really people we consider to be on the front lines of being able to prevent trafficking. And now more than ever, that also means parents, because a lot of kids, in fact, I think 29 million kids are now learning fully virtually at home at the moment, just in the United States. So the landscape of who's a frontline responder has shifted.
Absolutely. This week we're kind of exploring this question of what can we do.
Right.
So throughout all the episodes, we've been exploring stories of survivors. We've been really thinking about what are ways that we as parents or as educators can create safe and trusting relationships with the children in our lives and the young people in our lives, so that we can have these difficult conversations about trafficking. Ways that we can empower the young people in our lives and empower ourselves to take action to help Unitas prevent human trafficking in all its forms. And so today, our sort of finale episode of this season is thinking about what can each of us do beyond just talking to our kids about it. What can each of us do in our own unique sort of circumstances and situations in our lives, in our jobs, in our our activism, our community organizations that we're part of. How can we leverage those parts of our lives to take action to prevent human trafficking?
Right. And I think that's been, a common question that I've heard over the years, which is why I feel like this is such a good way to end the season. It's one thing to learn, about the issue of trafficking. And I think for many people, it might feel like, okay, trafficking is this big issue. How do I fit in, or what can I do? So I want to start the conversation by saying we're not asking anyone to save the world by themselves. We're not asking anyone to end human trafficking by themselves. You can make a really big difference in a very small way with small actions, or sharing information, creating resources in your own life and community. But you don't have to save the world. You can actually just help one person, and that would mean a lot to that one person. So I always tell people, like, take it down to the local level, whatever that local level looks like for you.
There was a phrase that I heard a few years ago that your statement just now reminds me of, which is, what is mine to do? And so what is mine to do is like you're saying, not to change the entire world, but that corner that I am uniquely qualified to make an impact on, and uniquely passionate to make an impact on. That's kind of what we're talking about today, is these more personal connections to this issue, and those ways to every day make a difference. Yeah,
absolutely. So I thought a natural way for us to start part of the conversation is I'll share a little bit about what drew me into this issue personally. And then I wanted to share an anecdote that I think makes the point that we all have a role to play. So I actually studied abroad when I was a teenager. Ended high school, a little early, and ran off to college before the usual person does. And I was in Europe, actually, in Germany. And somewhat ironically, I wanted to take German classes, and I found one that was like a women's only German class. And I was like, oh, okay. What I didn't realize is I was actually going to German class in a drop-in space for abused women. But I didn't know this. And so, but I noticed like something was a little different in the space. But one of the young women who was coming in, also a teenager, had been sold by her parents to a man there in Germany. And she was effectively his domestic slave. And he also was abusing her in other ways, him and his other wives. And so over the course of getting to know her, I started to realize that this wasn't your typical domestic violence, that she seemed to be also, being forced to work and wasn't being paid and wanted to leave but didn't know how. So basically what I was looking at was labor trafficking, but that terminology wasn't really in my mind. And so, fast forward a few years later, and my friend kind of vanished, if you will. I really don't know what happened to her, but I hope that she is safe somewhere. But that really, sat with me, that she just couldn't get the help that she needed. And there really wasn't, at that time, very many organizations that understood the issue of trafficking and understood what it would take to actually care for someone who's been through that. And more importantly, in my mind, like how could we get to a point where it doesn't get that far, where someone isn't actually exploited? And so that was the inspiration for me to start my own nonprofit and work with other organizations to not only help survivors, but also to look at what is real prevention. It's because there's a lot that goes into preventing trafficking, particularly for young people who are experiencing vulnerabilities. And again, trafficking is rooted in the concept that you have someone or a group of people who are very vulnerable and someone who's going to exploit that vulnerability for profit. And so I often say, and I know that economists everywhere would just roll over with agitation, but I'm in the supply reduction business. So I am, some people say they're fighting demand, and that's really important. I am trying to eliminate the supply by making them not as vulnerable. Because, as I always say, one of the things traffickers hates the most is an empowered kid. So that's sort of a background here. And then I wanted to also share, I was recently in touch with a family whose young son was sexually exploited online. And they kept saying, but I did everything right. We're volunteers. We work with other kids. We do all of this amazing, work in the community. So what did we do wrong? And my response is, you did everything right. But kids are kids. And the beautiful news is that you created an environment where your child came to you instead of hiding in shame and secrecy and potentially being exploited further. So how did they get to that point? With that volunteering and getting that trust with their kid. I think people often, again, they look at this issue as this big scary box, and it is really scary. But being able to pick apart what you can do to prevent it with your own child and around you is really critical. Liz, I know we had a couple of people who wrote in, so I'd love to kind of dive into what they wrote. I think you might be.
If you're watching live, sorry, I was muted. If you're watching live, feel free to kind of share some things in the chat too. So, one thing that I might share is, I'm a troop leader for a scouting organization, or I'm part of a multifamily pod for schooling, and so these things that might be a venue in which I can kind of address this issue. I am interacting with other people's children. Is there a way that I can do this? So if you've got questions about how can I use my alumni association, how can I use my role on city council in my town, those kind of parts of your life, please share them in the chat in whatever stream you're watching this on, and we can kind of I say we, Andrea, can share ideas of how you can leverage that to make an impact on this issue. So we'll dive into the ones that we have already. I know it looks like Jane and Sarah have shared a couple here too in the chat, and yeah, let's dive in. Let's talk about what can we do.
Excellent. Yeah, so I am looking to see if I have comments on, but I know that we had someone write in who is a lawyer, and that's kind of an easy one in some ways. Depends on, there are all kinds of lawyers and people with all kinds of backgrounds. I am not a lawyer, so I won't try to dive into all of that, but I can say that legal needs for survivors is often very high. And it's not just, people often think of legal needs in trafficking. They often think, okay, we're talking about, protecting someone in court while they're testifying against their trafficker. And that can be a big part of it, but there's also legal needs for someone who's, say, a foreign national who needs support in ensuring that their visa, their T visa, is appropriately filed and processed, or if they're applying for another legal remedy to stay here in the United States after being trafficked. There are other visas, but the T visa is the predominant one. There's also family court needs. So you might have a young survivor who is either a minor and looking to, be connected to their family, or they're going to be placed in foster care, so they need an advocate. They need someone to be there with them in court. Or it could be a survivor who has a child and is trying to navigate the child welfare system. And it can be a whole host of things. But how do you go from like being a lawyer in your office to a lawyer who helps a survivor? I would highly recommend a couple of avenues. And one is, if you know of an organization that provides legal relief to trafficking survivors in your area, I would reach out to them and offer that you are looking to provide pro bono services and are open to being trained on how to support survivors. Because there are definitely really great trainings out there for lawyers who want to get involved in that space. There's also a group called the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and surprise, they provide legal services to survivors. So that might be another organization to check out. And then if you're really kind of stumbling to figure out where to go, you can also contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline and ask them where in your area there might be another organization that you could volunteer at. And and obviously you don't just have one skill set of being a lawyer. There are other ways that you can be involved, but if we're purely thinking on a professional, like, giving back arena, that would be amazing. There's a huge amount of legal needs out there. Yeah, so I think there were a couple of other folks too.
Yeah, we had someone who is a grad student. So someone who's currently a grad student in social work. So may not be a practitioner quite yet, but is still kind of learning and getting training and getting certified on that. So
Excellent.
what might somebody in that situation be able to do?
Well, that sounds great, because there is always a need for people with a background and a degree in social work. In my previous organization, someone who was a graduate student in social work would be a prime target for our internship programs. But that would mean, but if that's not necessarily the avenue they're going with an internship, it's reaching out and saying, can I volunteer at a drop-in center or a youth center? And again, it's not just about finding organizations that work specifically with trafficking survivors, but volunteering at a Boys and Girls Club is a form of prevention. It's not like you're going to walk into the Boys and Girls Club and say, I'm here to prevent you from being trafficked. I mean, you could, but it probably wouldn't come off quite right. But more that you're volunteering to keep these kids connected to the community. Making sure if you're volunteering at a homeless shelter that, you're keeping your eyes and ears aware too, as you're volunteering of, someone who looks like maybe they're being taken advantage of, or they look like they're not really, in charge of their situation, but having the education as you walk into those spaces of what trafficking is, and being able to connect with people. Be it in a homeless shelter, be it in a foster group home, but there's a lot of places that need volunteers. And for a social work student, that's a great way to practice your skills for when you're looking for actual employment as a social worker. But so that would be something I would think of, particularly with that social work degree. But for other college students, whether you're an undergrad or grad school, the same kind of theory applies. If you have the time and the bandwidth to volunteer in your local community. And I know that we are in a very strange time right now as a global statement, but also in this country. So a lot of your volunteering might be virtual. It might be saying, okay, I can't meet you. I can't be out there in the community right now, but could you be an online tutor? Could you be a responsible adult that connects to a school group or a youth group and saying like you can volunteer to help a kid with math or with reading? There's a lot of need for that as well.
Well, I love how you put that too, of sort of redefining and expanding the definition of what trafficking prevention means. It's not just doing that explicit work or to educate or to raise awareness of the issue. It's again, back to Unitas, part of Unitas's whole mission is about empowering young people and making them feel connected and making them feel like they've got people in their lives they can talk to.
Especially now more than ever.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much isolation. There's a sense of like not understanding where the future is going to be for everyone. But I think, for kids, particularly teenagers who might be thinking, well, how am I going to get that scholarship to go to college if I can't actually do the activity that would have gotten me that scholarship? Or, how am I going to, participate in all of the activities that I normally like to do? So kids are now shifting more and more online or in smaller groups and just kind of redefining the world of possible. And, I tend to lean on the overly positive side, but I do think there are ways to build community with young people. And so if you're, a mom in a mom's Facebook group, organizing activities that are inclusive of kids outside of your network. So there's like your network, your moms or your friends who are on a Facebook group, but connecting to, a local youth group where there's other moms and saying like, let me give you a virtual break. Let's plug in on Zoom or wherever, and I will read stories or we will read stories so that your kids can like have a positive interaction, a social interaction with other kids and other, healthy adults while you go, do the dishes or do something else. But it's like really thinking through, okay, how do we help not only the kid, but the whole family? Because I think there's a lot of families right now that are really feeling isolated and overwhelmed. And when that starts to happen is when you start to see cracks, if you will, that traffickers can seep into on the online community. And that's really important to see.
Well, so kind of along those lines too, Mr. Washburn just posted around online gaming communities. And so if I'm an adult whose own children are involved in online gaming platforms and that kind of thing, because that is a space where our kids come into contact with people we don't know, or it can be. And so I think just how do we keep kind of an eye on that? But also if we're adults who are also in those gaming spaces, are there ways that we can kind of work within those spaces to prevent this?
So I want to add a caveat as we get started. I am not a gamer, and I know very little about it. I'm also not even remotely interested in being a gamer. So I am very much a visual in the real world kind of person. That said, I am around a few young people in my life who are younger kids, and they're playing, Roblox or, some of the other younger games. And the amount of viciousness that I've seen is shocking because it's very obvious that there are adults interacting with these kids. And I asked my 9-year-old, how do you know if someone's an adult versus a kid? And she's like, well, I don't know for sure, but grownups usually are the ones who say the mean stuff and they use big words. And so I just block them once I know they're a grown-up. And so if you're an adult and you're playing these games, no judgment, then, you identify that there's a kid in the group. I don't know if it's possible, but perhaps calling it out and saying, as adults, we should not be we should let kids have their space and we should be in our space. Or if you see that someone's being bullied, and whether it's an adult or a child, calling it out and saying, online bullying is just as vicious as in-person bullying. Or someone's starting to say inappropriate, sexist things, talking to your kids about the fact that that's not appropriate. No one would say that to your face. So it's not appropriate to say it online. And, I think kids who are growing up with this virtual reality being around their whole lives versus sort of it's coming to life, as like there were not cell phones and things like that. Well, I think there actually were, but there was not that accessibility when I was a little kid. And so to me, like my online community feels very different and separate from my real life community. But I think for a lot of kids, that's not the case. There's a kind of a fluidity. And so helping kids understand it's always inappropriate for an adult to say, sexual things to a kid, or, if there's someone you don't know who's pressuring to engage with you or always kind of at you online, that person's probably not a healthy person to engage with. And, as I was saying to this young family, that son was recently exploited, just because your kid interacts with someone online and maybe it goes further or it goes in a direction they don't think is appropriate, what the other person did is not their fault. And I think telling your child that, like, you are only responsible for you and your actions. What someone else does is their responsibility. And if they're being inappropriate, if they're saying mean things, if they are trying to, entice you to interact with them outside of the game, things like that, it's okay to go tell your parent and to cut it off. And if necessary, report it, because from my understanding, there's ways to report abuse. And I think that tool is not used enough, because that's a way to kind of stamp it out. But again, very surprised at the amount of verbal abuse that ranges from racism to sexism to just blatant grossness that's online and that kids are exposed to. And you're not going to be able to prevent your kid from playing these games. It's like moth to flame, particularly if there's not other things to do right now. Obviously there's books and all kinds of other good stuff, but sometimes that, the old school approach doesn't work in your kids online and you can't necessarily stop it. But just giving them that sense that they can tell you about it and that it's not appropriate. It's not appropriate for adults to be playing with kids.
We have a couple other questions too around, we've got one around sort of a neighborhood listserv. So a lot of us are on, Next Block or next door. Those kinds of neighborhood communication tools. So that's one question that we have. And then another is sort of local school foundations, or any kind of decision-making body for us, school board, local school council, PTA, school improvement team, those kinds of things. So I think those two would be, I know we have limited amount of time left, but I feel like those two would be really great to speak to.
For the listserv, I think it's really pointing out, okay, how can you share, information on that listserv about the issue of trafficking, or even posing the idea that you say, okay, we're going to have a watch party and we're going to, watch maybe our first episode on Trafficking 101 or another appropriate, short film where we can discuss like what trafficking looks like. But it's, with that listserv, you have an opportunity to educate more people. And also keep your eye out for, language around, I'm on a listserv for DC and I see a lot of language about like, there's this homeless person who's doing X, and so I often will reply and say, if that person needs services, here's, an organization that can reach out to them. And so flipping the script from looking at someone who is suffering, if they're homeless, from an isolation language to an inclusive, like, hey, that's our neighbor too. We can reach out for resources. So it's really just keeping the tone focused on helping those individuals, because those people are very at risk toward exploitation, trafficking, and very likely they've already been exploited. They're in that situation so visibly. Another, shifting more to like the school resource. I'm going to give an example of a woman who is a good friend of mine now, and she is an alumni of a very nice private school. And so she's been interested in how to bring trafficking prevention to students and teachers at that school. And so, if you are a part of an alumni association, reaching out to your school and saying, is this curriculum available to students? If not, how do we get them access? It can be virtual, it can be in person. If you are connected to a school because your child's in school, reaching out and saying, I want to make sure kids are educated about trafficking. How is this school district doing that? And if the answer is, I don't know, then getting them connected to Unitas or, another organization that can provide that education and resources, and making sure that teachers see the warning signs, because teachers should be able, even in a virtual space, to understand, okay, what are some risk factors? What are some things that I can keep my eye on? And how can I talk to that child and get them resources? So I think if you're connected to a school in any way, making sure that they're having those conversations is a great way to be connected, as well as asking if you can, volunteer at pickup drop off if you're back in school. Or I asked my daughter's teacher, would it be appropriate, if I read stories and offer, kind of external support for kids whose day ends early because school's getting out and they need that emotional connection. So those are some of my ideas.
That's great. I love the point about helping our neighbors see things a little bit differently and reframing it. I think you said from an exclusion to an inclusion, isolation to inclusion. Those are that person is our neighbor as well. I think that's a really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. And because I see a lot of language in these listservs about like, oh, there's a prostitute, over, in this area, and what are we going to do about it? And it's like, but how do you know that person's actually not a trafficking victim?
Yeah,
you don't actually. So calling the national hotline and making sure that someone is going to reach out to that individual to see if maybe they actually would really benefit from some support, because that person certainly needs help. If they're so visibly out there that you see it, then I can guarantee that people who would exploit that person also see them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Andrea, and thank you to everybody who joined us today, and who've joined us for the last several months as we've kind of worked through, because what we've been doing is we've been really working through this parent guide that Unitas has put together. And so we're sharing the link to how you can access that parent guide, to go a little bit deeper into some of these. There's some really great activities and resources to actually to do with your child, and that's for older kids. It's for 12 and up,
11 and up.
11 and up, yeah. So definitely check that out. We just posted that link in the chat. If you haven't watched all the episodes, I really encourage you to kind of go back through, and I know over the course of filming these, my knowledge has grown by exponents of just in terms of the way that not only my knowledge of the issue, but just like Andrea just demonstrated, just a way to reframe this and a way to shift your thinking about it to a way that's that you actually feel like you can have a role in. And again, back to that empowerment of the young people, but it's also empowerment of us as adults. So thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you to Unitas for sharing all of this with us. Let's keep the conversation going too. So Unitas has a community on Participate. There are resources in there. There's a discussion in there. So if you do have questions, that's a great way to get some answers directly from Andrea. And is there anything else that I'm neglecting?
No, thank you, Liz, for being our proxy learner. I can't even call you a proxy learner anymore. Now you're up there with me. I'm gonna have to see if there's things I can surprise you with. But I really enjoyed this season, and so grateful to everyone who helped make that possible. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation, continuing the work, and keeping kids safe from trafficking is incumbent upon all of us. So everyone who's participated, thank you for joining us in that endeavor.
Yeah. And I want to give one last plug. I know I'm a little bit scattered here, but I want to give another plug to the Know the Laws episode, as we are getting into the real deal of election season right now. Being aware and being conscious voters right now is very important. And so there are ways to really research policies, and voter consciousness on this issue. If this is something that you feel really strongly about, there are ways to, again, outside of the explicit pieces of it that are directly regarding human trafficking, there's a lot of ways to make an impact.
Exactly. And understanding, so Unitas is not a political organization, but I would like to say that, looking at the issue of trafficking as one of the issues that is a deciding factor for you is one way to be an advocate around this issue, for sure.
Yeah, and let your voice be heard. But thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Andrea, and we will see you soon.
See you soon. Bye.